In the summer of 1997, a 9-year-old girl named Emily Rains left a church gathering in rural Oregon and never came home. The streets were quiet, the pine trees heavy with dusk, and her family believed she would be back before dark. But by midnight, the town was searching with flashlights, calling her name into the timberline. The only trace was a white handkerchief left behind on a wooden pew. What began as an ordinary evening became the kind of silence that unsettled everyone who lived there. Over the years, neighbors whispered about chanting in the forest, about a hidden sect that met beyond the fields. It would take decades and a single courtroom exhibit to reveal what had really happened to Emily Rains. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from today, and if you want more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe. The last Sunday of June in 1997 felt unremarkable in the small Oregon Valley. Sunlight broke across the ridges, pale and thin, the kind that warmed the dust without ever touching the chill in the air. Families filed into the modest wooden church, its paint already flaking at the corners, its bell tower leaning slightly from decades of storms. It was the town's rhythm: Sunday evening gatherings with hymns, potluck dishes, and children darting through the gravel lot in shoes scuffed from summer play. 9-year-old Emily Rains was among them, a thin figure with restless energy, trailing a step behind her cousins. In her hand, she clutched a small white handkerchief, folded in careful squares. Her grandmother had pressed it into her palm weeks earlier, nothing more than a keepsake from an old drawer, but Emily had carried it everywhere since. She folded and unfolded it during sermons, tied knots in its corners, pressed it against her cheek when she grew tired. It was not precious by nature, but it became hers through habit. Her parents noticed it often, though never thought to remark. Inside the sanctuary, the wooden pews creaked beneath the congregation. Hymnals lay open, pages feathered at the edges from years of turning. The sound of voices swelled and fell, reverent and familiar, filling the room with a warmth that belonged more to tradition than to belief. Laura Rains, Emily's mother, watched her daughter fidget near the aisle, fingers working the fabric of the handkerchief as the final hymn began. David Rains, her father, kept one hand on the worn Bible he always carried, the other tapping absently against his leg. They would later remember that nothing in Emily's manner suggested the night would end differently from any other. When the hymn closed, the congregation spilled outside into the cooling air. Shadows stretched long across the gravel. Children raced toward the swings at the edge of the lot, their laughter mingling with the faint hum of cicadas. Adults stood in clusters, swapping stories about weather and crops, the ordinary concerns of an ordinary valley. The bell rang once, its tone dull and familiar, marking the evening's end. David glanced back toward the church doorway. Emily had been just behind him, still folding her handkerchief. He waved to a neighbor, turned back, and she was no longer there. At first, it seemed playful. She had run to join the other children or ducked behind the shed where stray cats sometimes lingered. He called her name, the sound sharp in the thinning air. No answer. Laura joined him, her voice higher, urgent. They circled the church grounds, checked the swings, the storage shed, the edges of the lot. Nothing. A few neighbors joined, flashlights slicing into shadows. Their beams caught dust in the air, then darkness again. By the time the last cars pulled away, unease had already rooted itself in the lot. Someone suggested Emily had gone home with another family, but each parent shook their head. She was nowhere. The search widened. Volunteers walked into the timberline, voices echoing her name through the trees. The night grew heavier, sounds sharper. A dog barked in the distance, then stopped. The silence that followed made every call seem swallowed whole. Some searchers returned whispering of strange sounds beyond the pines. They spoke of voices layered together, a cadence too steady to be wind. Others dismissed it, echoes of the hymn still ringing in their ears, nothing more. Yet the story spread among the crowd, muttered as they passed lanterns hand to hand. Chants, someone said, a chorus rising in the dark. Inside the sanctuary, Laura stepped back into the pew where Emily had sat. The room was empty now, the air cool against stone floors. On the wooden bench lay the handkerchief, white against dark wood, folded with care as if placed intentionally. Laura picked it up, holding it in her palms. The fabric smelled faintly of cedar polish and something else, something softer, as though warmth still clung to it. She pressed it to her cheek, eyes closing. Later, she would insist that Emily never left it behind. The sheriff, Roy Mercer, arrived with deputies after the first hour of searching. He asked questions, simple ones. Had Emily ever wandered? Had she argued? Had she shown fear? David answered with clipped words. Laura kept her eyes on the handkerchief. When neighbors mentioned the sounds in the woods, Mercer shook his head. Echoes, he said. People hear what they expect to hear. He promised a full search at first light, but parents rarely trust the sun to fix what the dark steals. Volunteers stayed, walking deeper into the timber, lanterns glowing like scattered stars. They returned with nothing but unease. The forest gave back no prints, no clothing, no voice. Only the story of chants grew louder, repeating itself until it began to feel like truth. By midnight, the lot had thinned to only the closest friends and family. Cars idled with headlights pointed toward the tree line, their beams fading before they reached the first ridge. David stood beside his truck, arms folded tight, eyes fixed on the black wall of trees. Laura remained inside, handkerchief pressed between her fingers, rocking slightly on the pew as if motion might fill the absence. The church creaked in the cooling night. Hymnals still lay open on their pages, verses frozen in place. The bell tower groaned once in the wind, then fell silent. In that silence, across the timber, something stirred again. Faint, layered, almost hidden in the hum of insects. A child's hymn, carried on more than one voice, drifting low and steady before fading once more into the dark. Dawn crept over the valley with a pale light, thin as gauze, uncovering a town that had not slept. Cars lined the gravel lot outside the church, windows fogged from bodies waiting inside. The Raines family stood apart, eyes fixed on the tree line. Laura still carried the white handkerchief, clenched so tightly her knuckles were drained of color. The fabric had become the last tether, ordinary cloth now bearing the weight of absence. Search parties gathered again at first light. Farmers with boots still muddy from fields. Students still in last night's jackets. Mothers carrying thermoses of weak coffee. The sheriff's deputies set up a crude map on the hood of a cruiser, drawing grids with a grease pencil. Volunteers fanned into the timber with sticks and flashlights, though daylight made the beams unnecessary. Each call of Emily's name echoed back hollow, bouncing between ridges until it sounded like someone else's voice. By mid-morning, whispers began to eclipse orders. Several searchers claimed they had heard the same low cadence again. Not words, but a rhythm threaded beneath the wind. One described it as like a prayer sung backwards, another as a chant that didn't need language. Sheriff Mercer brushed it off, insisting tired minds play tricks. Yet as the day lengthened, the rumor only thickened. People spoke of old gatherings in the woods, of secret vigils that predated the town itself. Inside the Raines' kitchen, relatives assembled. Mark, Emily's uncle, pinned a county map to the wall, pushing thumbtacks into every spot a volunteer reported movement. He circled the church, the river crossing, and the old mill road. Beside the map, Laura taped the handkerchief, insisting it be treated like evidence, though it was only fabric in the eyes of most. Still, her gesture gave the cloth a new role. No longer comfort, but proof. Neighbors arrived with food no one touched. Conversations drifted toward memory. A girl seen kneeling by candles. A boy who once claimed to witness robes moving in the night. None of the stories aligned, yet each carried the same refrain. There were others in the woods. Mark took notes in a ledger, handwriting sharp, as if making it official could turn rumor into record. That evening, a volunteer named Ruth stepped forward. She claimed she had seen a circle of figures near the tree line around the time Emily vanished. Hooded, silent, lit only by candlelight. She admitted she could not see their faces, nor be certain Emily was with them. But her story spread faster than Mercer could contain it. By sundown, the town no longer spoke of a missing child. They spoke of a gathering. The sheriff attempted to redirect focus. He mentioned the church's attendance book, where names had been logged the night Emily disappeared. Everyone accounted for, nothing unusual. Yet, when a deputy placed the book on his desk, Laura noticed Emily's name marked with a small cross beside it. No other child's name carried such a mark. The sheriff said it was a clerical habit, but Laura refused to accept that. To her, it looked intentional, like someone had chosen her daughter before the hymn ever began. As night fell again, the community organized a candlelight vigil outside the church. Flames flickered in paper cups, casting long shadows across gravel. Hymns rose shakily, voices trembling at the edges. Laura stood in the circle, handkerchief folded in her palm. At some point, another hand reached out and laid the cloth beside a candle at the vigil's center. Whether meant as tribute or ritual, no one could tell. The fabric caught the glow, its whiteness turned gold by firelight. And then, in the silence between verses, someone whispered. The words were indistinct, but the cadence was familiar, almost identical to what had been heard in the woods. One voice became two, then several, until it seemed the vigil itself was split. Some praying, others chanting. A current of unease rippled through the crowd. Parents pulled children closer. Flames guttered in the night wind, throwing shadows across the church walls. The vigil ended abruptly, with murmurs replacing song. People drifted away in uneasy pairs, unwilling to speak the last sound they had heard. Only Laura remained, staring at the handkerchief still resting beside the dying candle. The wax had dripped across the gravel, hardening into shapes that looked like letters no one could read. When the final flame winked out, darkness folded over the lot once more, and from somewhere deep in the timber, faint and steady, came the echo of voices no one could claim. The night closed on a chant without words, carried by the trees. By the third day, the search had stretched beyond the valley. State troopers arrived with dogs, their leashes taut as they dragged handlers through the underbrush. Reporters trailed close behind, cameras whirring, questions sharp as the click of shutters. They asked about chanting, about robes, about cults. The town resisted at first, but rumor had already grown teeth. The teenagers were the loudest in their stories. One girl, Lisa Turner, said she had seen candles flickering near the old cemetery the very night Emily vanished. She described figures circling gravestones, their movements stiff, their heads bowed. Another boy claimed he'd found symbols scratched into tree bark, though when deputies checked, they found only initials carved years earlier. Sheriff Mercer dismissed these accounts as mischief, but reporters wrote them down as fact. At the Rains' home, every whisper reached the kitchen table. Laura sat with her sister Ruth, who replayed each story in hushed tones, her words carrying the weight of possibility. David tried to silence them, his focus on the dogs combing the ridge, but even he felt the shift. The search was no longer for a missing child. It was for a gathering, a secret, hidden in the woods. That evening, investigators discovered remnants near the timber's edge. Candle wax pooled in the soil, thin as glass, and a half-burned matchbook stamped with the name of a diner 2 towns away. The sheriff bagged them, reluctant to speculate. But when word spread, townsfolk took them as confirmation. The chanting was real, and it had props. At the church, families gathered again, setting fresh candles along the steps. A vigil became a watch. Parents kept their children close, yet eyes drifted always toward the trees. Hymns sounded brittle, faltering at the edges. Each time the wind shifted, some swore they heard another layer beneath the singing. A murmur threaded into the night. Laura placed Emily's handkerchief beside the candles once more. This time it looked less like comfort, more like offering. She watched the flame dance against its white fabric, the shadows playing along folds her daughter's hands had once pressed. For a moment she thought she heard a giggle, a sound like Emily's laugh, carried across the lot. She reached out, but there was nothing. Deputies combed the cemetery after Lisa's story. They found melted wax pooled on cracked headstones, hardened into thin rivers across the stone. Some candles still stood upright, blackened stubs barely clinging to wicks. The troopers marked the ground, collected samples, and moved on. But the townspeople lingered. They whispered that the cemetery had been used for something more than mourning. That night, while the sheriff filed his report, a neighbor spotted a lone figure at the edge of the graveyard. Too far to see clearly, but tall, unmoving, framed by the glow of a single candle. The man swore the figure remained even after the flame guttered out, as if the dark itself had taken shape. He turned away only once, and when he looked back, the figure was gone. The story spread faster than the official report. By morning, the graveyard had become another landmark on the town's map of fear. In the Rains' home, Laura unfolded the handkerchief on the kitchen table. The fabric lay flat, pale against the wood. She traced its edges with her fingers, whispering her daughter's name as though the cloth might answer. Mark leaned over her shoulder, insisting it should be turned in to the sheriff as evidence. But Laura refused. It was all she had left. The day closed with another search that found nothing. Troopers filed back into their cars. Deputies locked evidence in cabinets. Reporters scribbled notes into notepads. Yet in the town, silence carried louder than newsprint, and at the graveyard's edge, where wax still clung to stone, the outline of a boot print lingered in the soft soil, small, fragile, no larger than a child's. The wind shifted, and the candle stubs trembled as if stirred by unseen breath. The fourth night pressed heavier than the ones before. Clouds rolled down from the ridges, flattening the valley in a damp haze. Headlights swept along the church lot, casting pale arcs against the timber. People arrived not only to search but to watch, as if the woods themselves might reveal something under enough eyes. Inside the Rains' home, the atmosphere thickened. David paced the hallway, his boots leaving scuffs in the linoleum. Laura remained at the kitchen table, the handkerchief spread before her like an anchor. Mark, the uncle, tacked another map to the wall, drawing lines between points the volunteers had reported. Circles formed, sightings of candles, whispers of chants, glimpses of figures that dissolved into night. The map resembled a net, though nothing had been caught. By evening, the family decided to join the search themselves. Laura insisted on carrying the handkerchief, folding it into her pocket as though it might guide her steps. She said Emily had touched it more than any other object, and if anything could connect them, this was it. David said nothing, but his silence carried more than words. Volunteers gathered at the trailhead, flashlights pointed into the pines. Some carried hymnals, others carried hunting lamps. The crowd split between faith and force. Sheriff Mercer tried to establish order, laying out search grids with measured precision. His voice cut through the murmurs, but only barely. The talk of chanting had grown into belief, and belief does not yield easily to instruction. The group moved into the forest in staggered lines. Branches snapped underfoot, beams of light slicing across bark. At one point, a deputy's radio crackled, filling the air with static. Then, faintly, a sound emerged, a recording from the previous night's channel. It wasn't static. It was voices, layered, rising and falling in cadence. The deputy swore he hadn't played it, that the machine simply caught echoes. The file was logged, though never explained. Back at the church, a smaller crowd gathered for another vigil. Candles flickered on the steps, their flames dancing in the wind. Among them, a copy of a hymn sheet lay open, its pages damp from dew. A child had scribbled drawings in the margins, circles, stars, and shapes that resembled eyes. Parents swore their children hadn't drawn them. The page was collected, added to the growing pile of fragments that hinted at more than absence. Laura returned from the forest near midnight, clothes damp with mist, the handkerchief clenched in her palm. She stood before the vigil candles, watching wax pool around their bases. Someone whispered behind her that the cloth was a charm, a token that carried her daughter's presence. Others nodded, their belief sliding toward ritual. Laura didn't correct them. She only pressed the fabric tighter against her hand. As the last searchers emerged from the trees, weary and empty-handed, the vigil quieted. A hush fell over the crowd, deeper than silence, as if the forest itself had paused. Then, from the edge of the lot, where the shadows thickened, a cassette tape clicked to life. An old portable recorder, forgotten in a box, had been triggered by some unknown hand. From its speaker came a tune not sung in decades, a hymn, slowed and warped. Voices stretched into something almost unrecognizable. Parents covered their children's ears. Sheriff Mercer yanked the batteries free. The recorder died, but the impression lingered. On the tape was a song, but beneath it, softer, another line wove through, an unfamiliar melody, faint and unsettling. The recorder was placed in an evidence bag, though no one admitted owning it. The vigil ended in fragments, people leaving in hurried silence, unwilling to speak of what they'd heard. In the empty lot, candles guttered one by one. Wax dripped into the gravel, forming hardened lines like runes no one could read. And in the hush that followed, the last note of the warped hymn seemed to hang in the air, unfinished, swallowed before its final word. By the fifth day, the town no longer needed reporters to spread the story. Rumor had become its own current, flowing through kitchens, diners, and gas stations. Every conversation circled back to Emily, to the candles, to the chant no one admitted knowing, yet everyone claimed to have heard. At the Rains house, the air smelled of burned coffee and sleeplessness. Laura sat at the table, the handkerchief pressed flat beneath her palm. She ironed it earlier that morning, smoothing creases as though restoring order might restore her daughter. David lingered near the window, blinds half drawn, watching cars slow as they passed. Mark was on the phone, voice clipped, speaking to someone who refused to give a name. The caller claimed to have seen Emily. He described a circle of people in robes, walking with a child through the woods. His voice crackled over the line, distorted but insistent. He swore the group had taken her beyond the river, toward an abandoned quarry. He hung up before Mercer could trace the call. Laura clutched the handkerchief tighter, believing, if only for a moment, that the voice was telling the truth. She whispered that the quarry was less than 5 miles from the church, close enough for the chanting to carry. David wanted to dismiss it, yet his silence betrayed the faint glimmer of hope. Sheriff Mercer dispatched deputies to the site. They found nothing, no prints, no clothing, only a rusted chain-link fence rattling in the wind. Yet in the gravel near the entrance lay a cassette case, cracked open, with no tape inside. The sheriff pocketed it, uneasy. Later, an evidence tech noted faint traces of wax along its edge, as though it had been placed near a burning candle. Back in town, neighbors gathered again for vigil. This one felt different, less prayer and more ritual. Candles were arranged in deliberate circles on the church steps. Children were told to stand inside the ring while parents sang hymns in hushed voices. Laura tried to keep her focus on the cloth in her hand, but the sound unsettled her. It was as if the vigil itself had slipped into imitation of the chants. As the crowd sang, the sound of laughter cut through, a child's giggle, high and fleeting. Heads turned sharply, scanning for movement. Some swore it came from the trees, others from within the circle of candles. A few whispered that Emily was near, drawn to the vigil by the handkerchief her mother still carried. Mercer ended the gathering abruptly, extinguishing candles and dispersing the crowd. He took the handkerchief from Laura's palm, insisting it be examined formally. She resisted, shouting that it was hers, but David intervened, pressing it into the sheriff's hand. It was logged, bagged, and sent to the station. At home, Laura sat empty-handed for the first time since Emily disappeared. The absence of the cloth felt as sharp as the absence of her daughter. Late that night, deputies replayed the anonymous call from earlier in the day. Beneath the distorted voice was another sound, faint but undeniable, the delicate chime of a wind ornament. Mercer recognized it immediately. It belonged to the porch of a farmhouse near the edge of town, a place whose owner had never joined the search, never lit a candle at the vigils. The tape ended, leaving the room in silence. The deputies glanced at each other. unsettled. Outside the station, the night was still, yet through the open window a sound carried, the faint ring of wind chimes, struck by air no one could feel. Morning light revealed little comfort. Reporters were stationed outside the church, their vans cluttering the lot, cables coiled like snakes along the gravel. Headlines now carried words like cult and ritual, though no one could say who began it. Neighbors turned wary, conversations clipped, glances quick. The town had shifted from searching for a child to defending itself against the story it was becoming. Deputies returned from the farmhouse with nothing more than silence. The porch wind chime swayed in the breeze, its tones identical to those on the recording, but the owner denied any involvement. He claimed he had been visiting relatives the night Emily vanished, though no one could verify his alibi. Mercer logged the statement and moved on, but unease lingered. That afternoon, volunteers searching near the river made a discovery. In the mud along the bank lay a cluster of small footprints, half washed away by current. Some were shaped like a child's, narrow and uncertain, but there were others, larger, sharper, pressed deeper into the soil. Before casts could be taken, the rising water blurred them into indistinct hollows. Only photographs remained, grainy and dark, more suggestion than proof. Near the same spot, a deputy pulled a scrap of fabric from a thorn bush. It was white, frayed at the edges, no larger than a coin purse. Laura was summoned to identify it. She studied the weave, her eyes filling when she realized it matched the handkerchief she had carried. The cloth had been torn, separated, yet unmistakable. Mercer ordered it sealed in a bag, the first tangible trace beyond rumor. Back at the Rains' home, Mark added another pin to his growing map. Circles spread wider now. The church, the cemetery, the quarry, and now the river. Each location linked by stories of candles, chants, or fragments of cloth. He argued that the sites formed a pattern, some kind of path. Laura stared at the map without answering, her thoughts fixed on the torn fabric sealed behind plastic. That night, the community gathered again, though the vigil felt hollow. Candles burned low, their flames fighting against the damp wind. Hymns faltered before they began. The handkerchief's fragment was the only subject anyone wanted to discuss, and it hung in the air like smoke. Proof that Emily had been moved, that she had crossed from church to river under someone else's hand. As the vigil ended, rain began to fall. Drops hissed against flames, extinguishing them one by one. A final candle sputtered near the church steps, its wax dripping onto an open page of a Bible left there by some unknown hand. When the rain cleared, the page had warped, curling upward. Across it, letters had bled together, leaving jagged black lines like scratches instead of words. The Bible was collected, added to the growing pile of artifacts. Some called them evidence, others called them signs. At the riverbank, where the footprints had blurred away, the water carried torn pages downstream. They gathered at bends in the current, fragments of scripture reduced to pulp, floating aimlessly toward the sea. And as the last line of hymn faded from the churchyard, a single page surfaced at the edge of the current, edges shredded, words half gone. It showed only one phrase still legible, stark in the fading light. "Deliver us from evil." The town woke under a sky the color of ash. Mist clung to the ridges, dampening every sound, as though the valley itself wished for silence. By now, the case had outgrown its boundaries. Cars from neighboring towns crowded the lot, their drivers offering help or simply staring, curious to witness what had become rumor-turned spectacle. That morning, deputies followed a lead deeper into the forest. A hunter claimed he had seen smoke rising from an abandoned logging trail, too steady to be a campfire. Mercer led the team himself, boots sinking into moss as the trail narrowed between blackened stumps. For hours, they pushed through undergrowth until a clearing opened suddenly, startling in its stillness. At the center stood a shack, half rotten, its roof sagging with years of neglect. The door hung ajar, creaking on its hinges with each draft of wind. Inside, the air was thick with mildew and something sharper, a tang that caught in the throat. Along the walls, symbols had been scrawled in charcoal, circles intersecting lines, crude stars, repeated over and over until the boards themselves seemed bruised. Some were smudged, others recent enough to stain fingertips. On a makeshift altar fashioned from crates, deputies found stubs of candles, their wax pooled and hardened. Beside them lay a children's shoe, worn at the sole, laces tied in a careful bow. Laura, summoned to the site, confirmed it belonged to Emily. She pressed her hand against the wall for support, refusing to step further inside. David took her elbow, his face set in stone. Mercer ordered photographs. Each candle was logged, each symbol sketched. In one corner, beneath a loose floorboard, they uncovered something faint, the print of a child's hand, pressed into dust. Its size was undeniable. A deputy shined his light over it, and for a moment, the air itself seemed to still. The shack was sealed with tape that night, though its image had already burned into the town's memory. For those who believed in rituals, it was confirmation. For those who trusted only in evidence, it was the first concrete place where Emily had been. Word spread fast. Crowds gathered at the church steps, demanding answers, demanding arrests. Mercer held back, unwilling to name suspects without proof. But restraint mattered little. In whispers, names were already chosen. Parents warned children away from certain houses. Doors that had once been open now closed at the sight of neighbors. At the Rains' home, Laura retrieved the handkerchief from the evidence locker, insisting on its return. Mercer resisted, but she refused to leave without it. She placed it on the table beside the map, smoothing its folds with deliberate care. To her, it was no longer comfort. It was the thread tying every fragment together. That evening, the town tried another vigil. Candles lit the church steps once more, though their flames shivered under the damp wind. People prayed, but their voices carried differently now. Less faith, more fear. Some whispered that chanting might drive the darkness back, that mimicking the rhythm could confuse whatever had taken Emily. A circle formed, hesitant at first, then firm. Voices rose, not in hymn, but in a strange echo of the sound that had haunted them for nights. Laura stood outside the circle, handkerchief in her grasp, watching the transformation of grief into ritual. She felt Emily's absence in every note, yet also something else, a distortion, as if her daughter's name were being reshaped in the air. David pulled her away, unwilling to let the scene consume her. Later, when the candles were extinguished and the crowd dispersed, Mercer returned to the shack with 2 deputies. The night air was colder, the trees restless with wind. Inside, the candles remained as they had been, but one detail had changed. On the crate where they had sat, a single stub now leaned sideways, its wick blackened, as though burned again after the place had been sealed. The floor beneath it held fresh wax, glossy and new. The deputies exchanged glances, their flashlights trembling slightly. Mercer bagged the stub without speaking. On the way back to town, none of them mentioned the possibility that someone had returned. At sunrise, the shack stood empty once more. Tape flapped against its frame, useless against the certainty that eyes had lingered there after the searchers left. The air inside carried the faint scent of smoke, as if a candle had guttered only minutes before dawn. And beneath the crate, hidden in the grain of the wood, a faint smear of white clung where wax had pooled. When the light caught it, the color looked less like wax and more like fabric, frayed thin, a thread torn from something once folded in a child's hand. The town began to fracture in ways no one could disguise. Some believed Emily had been taken by a hidden sect, convinced the shack was proof of a gathering that had lived in shadow for years. Others whispered it was no more than an isolated crime, twisted into ritual by fear. In kitchens and storefronts, arguments flared. What had begun as grief was splitting into factions. Laura Rains tried to move among her neighbors, seeking allies where she could. She carried the handkerchief with her, folded neatly in her pocket, as if it might persuade those who hesitated to look her in the eye. She would knock on doors with David at her side, ask about the night of the disappearance, ask who had left early, who had wandered outside. Most answered with clipped voices, wary of giving too much. Yet she persisted, holding the handkerchief in her palm as she spoke, the cloth no longer comfort but a quiet demand. Mark, her brother, added new pins to his map each day. The lines stretched across the valley like veins, connecting church, river, quarry, and shack. To him, the pattern was undeniable. Every site formed a circle around the town, a ring of silence closing in. He believed Emily had been moved deliberately from one place to the next, as though guided along a ritual path. He showed the map to Mercer, who dismissed it as speculation. But even Mercer felt the weight of the pattern when he looked too long. That week, a new fragment surfaced. A traffic camera along the county road recorded a grainy image. A dark pickup truck moving past the church at the hour Emily disappeared. Its headlights were dim, its license plate unreadable, but the shape was distinct. The sheriff released no statement, but deputies began quietly asking about trucks, about repairs, about who had left town that night. Rumors only deepened. Some claimed they had seen the same truck idling near the cemetery days earlier. Others insisted it had parked outside the diner linked to the matchbook found in the woods. Each story stretched the net wider, pulling in more names than proof could sustain. By now, suspicion had become a kind of chant itself, repeated endlessly until it echoed louder than fact. The vigil that weekend swelled beyond the church lot. Hundreds came, some from neighboring towns, drawn by curiosity or fear. Candles lined the steps in concentric rings, glowing like eyes against the night. Voices rose again, this time not hymns but something stranger, half prayer, half imitation of the chanting rumored in the woods. Parents held children close, whispering that mimicry might ward off the same darkness. Others looked away, ashamed at the blurring of worship and desperation. Laura stood at the edge of the crowd, the handkerchief pressed against her lips. She could taste the fabric's faint soap, the hint of cedar from church pews, the salt of her own tears. The cloth had passed from toy to relic to something else entirely, a boundary between memory and ritual. She feared what it meant to the town, even as she clung to it herself. That night, Mercer drove past the vigil, headlights sweeping across candles that seemed endless. His deputy pointed out a reflection in the church windows, a shape that looked like a figure cloaked in black, though no one stood there when they checked. Mercer said nothing. He had learned by now that silence spread slower than words. Later, while the crowd thinned, a boy approached Laura. He couldn't have been more than 12, his eyes wide with fear. He said he had seen a man in a long coat watching from a parked truck at the edge of the lot. When Laura asked who, he shook his head. "Not from here," he whispered. But he knew the songs. By morning, new pins had been added to Mark's map, circling the town tighter than ever. The shape on the paper looked like a snare. He warned his sister that whoever orchestrated this was drawing the family inward, pushing them closer to something they were not meant to see. Laura traced the circle with her finger, then laid the handkerchief over its center, covering the church. The town woke to rain the next day. Candles left on the steps had melted into formless lumps, their wicks drowned in puddles. But one flame still burned stubbornly, a stub of wax shielded beneath the porch. Its smoke curled into the damp air, leaving a trace no wind could carry away. And in the windshield of a truck parked a street away, water streaked down glass that reflected something not there. A silhouette in a hood, its outline quivering with each drop. By the 9th day, the story had devoured the valley. Outsiders arrived with cameras, preachers came with warnings, and strangers stood at the edge of the lot to watch the church as though it were a stage. Families locked doors that had once been open. Children were kept from the streets, and the word cult was whispered like a curse. Inside the Rains' home, the handkerchief rested at the center of the table. Laura kept smoothing its folds, though the fabric had stiffened with time and handling. It had become an object others wanted to see, some asking to touch it, some insisting it carried meaning. She refused every request. It was not a relic to her. It was Emily's, and Emily's alone. That morning, investigators opened a box collected from the shack. Among candle stubs and wax flakes lay a thin sheaf of paper, water-stained but legible. It was a handwritten hymn, copied in uneven script. On its back were notations, dates, initials, and one name circled twice: Emily. Deputies exchanged uneasy looks before carrying it to Sheriff Mercer. He studied it in silence, then placed it in an evidence sleeve. For the first time, the fragments of ritual pointed to something deliberate. The list of initials matched known members of the congregation. At the bottom was the full name of a man long trusted in the church: Jonas Hale, the pastor's assistant. He had been at every vigil, lighting candles, leading hymns, his presence so familiar no one had thought to question it. But in the hymn sheet, his name appeared again and again, tied to nights when chanting had been reported. Mercer ordered surveillance. Deputies followed Jonas quietly, noting his movements, his late walks along the timber roads. They recorded him carrying boxes into the church basement, emerging hours later with his clothes dusted in wax. That evening, the handkerchief changed again. It was collected officially, logged as evidence. Laura wept when it left her hand, the deputies promising its return. In the lab light, faint stains surfaced along its edge, small dark flecks invisible before. The test would take time, but the sight alone deepened the chill. At vigil that night, Jonas led the singing once more. His voice rose above the others, steady, commanding, yet behind his eyes there was something unreadable. Parents pulled children closer, some whispering his name with doubt for the first time. Laura stood apart, empty-handed, watching him carefully. Each word from his lips seemed weighted, deliberate, carrying the rhythm of the chants described for days. Mercer made no move. He waited, letting the town hear the voice they had mistaken for prayer. Later, when the crowd thinned, he slipped into the church basement. The room smelled of wax and damp stone. On a shelf rested more hymn sheets, some blank, others scrawled with initials. In one corner lay a crate with melted wax pooled along its bottom, and pressed against the crate's side, stuck fast to dried wax, was a thread of white fabric, no larger than a fingernail clipping. Mercer bagged it, his hand steady though his jaw tightened. He knew the lab would compare it to the handkerchief. He knew the stain would tell its own story. When he left the basement, the sanctuary above was empty, yet the air still carried the echo of a song, faint, unbroken, as though voices lingered where bodies had already gone. By dawn, the town awoke to a shift. For weeks, suspicion had been scattered, a net flung wide. Now it narrowed, focusing on one man who had stood in plain sight. Jonas Hale, once a helper at the altar, had become the shadow at its center. Still, no arrest was made. Mercer waited, watching, gathering enough to turn whispers into proof. But the community no longer needed evidence. They had already chosen their story. On the Rains map, Mark circled the basement in thick black ink. Laura placed her hand on the mark, her eyes hollow. She whispered that Emily had been there, she could feel it. David looked away, unable to agree, unable to deny. That night, as another vigil flickered, Jonas lifted his hands in prayer. Flames bent toward him, smoke curling like ribbons. And in the hush between verses, Laura thought she heard her daughter's name buried in his voice, stretched and drawn until it became something else entirely. The hymn ended, but the sound remained, low and steady, echoing inside the church walls long after silence had fallen. The days that followed carried a tension so thick it seemed to slow the valley itself. Conversations halted when Jonas Hale passed, yet he still carried himself as though nothing had changed. He swept the church floors, arranged hymnals, even lit candles for evening vigils. Children avoided his gaze, and parents steered them away. But no one spoke aloud what they all now feared. Mercer built his case quietly. He requested records from the state crime lab, the kind of paperwork he rarely trusted but now needed. The first confirmation came back in a thin envelope. The handkerchief Laura had guarded showed traces of blood. Old stains, faint, but human. Another slip of paper followed days later, noting that fibers collected in the shack matched its weave. The fragment had not wandered there by accident. Still, the sheriff did not move. He wanted more than fragments, more than rumor twisted into ritual. He needed something undeniable, a thread that would hold in court. Deputies trailed Jonas on his late walks. They watched him drive a battered sedan down timber roads at night, park for hours without explanation. They saw him carry boxes into the church basement and emerge with hands streaked in wax. Each report thickened the file, but Mercer waited. Inside the Rains' home, the map on the wall had grown cluttered. Mark's pins sprawled outward, connected by red string that looped like veins across the valley. At its center, always, stood the church. Laura sat before it with hollow eyes, her hand pressed against the empty space where the handkerchief had once rested. She whispered Emily's name, syllables fraying with each repetition, as though calling her back might bend the world enough to return her. David grew quieter with each day. He avoided the vigils now, unable to watch the town twist hymns into something darker. Instead, he walked the edge of the fields at night, listening for sounds he could not name. Once, near the river, he heard a laugh, sharp and fleeting, carried over the current. He froze, certain for an instant that it was Emily, but the water rushed louder, drowning it away, leaving only his heartbeat in his ears. The vigil that week drew fewer families. Candles burned low, their flames thin against the damp air. Jonas led again, his voice stronger than ever, filling the silence left by absent neighbors. He closed his eyes as he sang, his hands raised, and in that posture he looked less like a servant of faith than a conductor pulling unseen voices from the dark. Parents shifted uneasily. Laura stared without blinking. Mercer had planted a recorder in the church basement earlier that day. When deputies retrieved it after the vigil, the tape carried more than footsteps. Faintly, between the scrape of chairs, a girl's voice whispered, "Just once, just enough." Some swore it said help. Others insisted it was nothing but a trick of echoes. The tape was sealed, its contents marked for lab review. Days later, another fragment arrived. Hair collected from the shack floor, fine and pale. Under a microscope, it matched Emily's, strand for strand. The evidence had crossed from rumor to certainty. The sheriff's jaw tightened when he read the report. At last, he had what he needed. That evening, Mercer summoned Jonas to the station. He sat across the table, light buzzing above, file thick with notes between them. The handkerchief lay sealed in its bag, the torn fragment aligned against it. Mercer slid the photographs across the table, the shack, the shoe, the smear of wax. Jonas studied them without expression, his hands folded neatly, his voice calm. He denied everything. He spoke of vigil traditions, of candles lit in memory, of hymns sung for comfort. He smiled as he said it, a smile that left deputies unsettled. When Mercer pressed about the basement, Jonas tilted his head as though amused by the question. He said faith required space for prayer, that candles meant nothing more than light in the dark. But his voice carried an edge, a rhythm too deliberate, and for a moment the room seemed smaller, the air heavier. Laura sat in the hallway outside the interrogation room, her body rigid. She could not hear the words, but she felt them in the vibrations through the floor. She imagined her daughter's name folded into each sentence, reshaped until it became unrecognizable. Hours passed. Jonas denied, diverted, smiled. Yet the evidence file remained between them, thickening with every report. Mercer closed the folder with steady hands. He knew it would take a jury, not a room, to finish what had begun. That night, the church stood empty, candles still lining its steps. Wind moved through the lot, scattering wax stubs like bones. Inside, hymnals lay open, pages curled from damp. The sanctuary felt colder than the night air, as if the building itself had exhaled. And in the basement, where the recorder had captured whispers, the last candle stub guttered out on its own, leaving only the trace of smoke curling upward, a thread dissolving into dark. The courthouse smelled of old wood and dust, the kind that settles in cracks no broom can reach. Families filled the benches, pressed shoulder to shoulder, whispering until the bailiff called for silence. At the front, The Raines family sat stiff, Laura with her hands folded over her lap, David staring straight ahead. On the table before the jury, a series of plastic bags lay arranged like relics. Candle stubs, hymn sheets, scraps of wax, and the handkerchief that had traveled from pew to vigil to evidence locker. The prosecutor, Karen Doyle, rose with a steady voice. She began not with accusation but with image. Emily stepping out of the church into the evening air, handkerchief in her small hand, never to return. Each object in evidence was tied to that moment. The candle wax pooled in the shack, the hymn sheet marked with her name, the fibers that matched the cloth she carried. And then, finally, the DNA strands, tiny fragments that had survived in dust and wax, threads tying every artifact to the child the town had lost. Jonas Hale sat at the defense table, his posture upright, his expression calm. He did not flinch when the handkerchief was displayed, nor when the jury leaned closer to see its faint stains. He watched Laura instead, his eyes fixed as if she alone held the key to the story being told. She did not look back. Witnesses spoke of the vigils, of chants heard in the timber, of wax dripping across gravestones. Some faltered under cross-examination, their stories tangled in rumor. Yet the artifacts remained, silent and undeniable. The handkerchief was passed from one gloved hand to another, its fabric dulled from years but still carrying the faint trace of blood along its edge. Mark took the stand with his map. Red strings stretched across photographs, linking church to shack, river to quarry. The defense called it obsession. A family's grief turned into conspiracy. But the jury studied it long, eyes tracing the circle until the shape seemed undeniable. Through it all, Laura sat motionless. The handkerchief was no longer hers to hold, yet it remained tethered to her in every glance, every mention. It had become more than fabric. It was the path of her daughter's absence, laid bare in a courtroom for all to see. The defense argued ritual meant nothing, that candles and hymns were tradition twisted by fear. But when the state lab confirmed the pale strands of hair matched Emily's, the room shifted. The fragments no longer whispered. They spoke with the weight of fact. On the final day, the prosecutor held the handkerchief high, its edges trembling under courtroom light. She spoke of how it began as a child's comfort, became a mother's relic, and ended as proof. This cloth, she said, carried her presence into the room where she was last alive. It carries her still. The jury retired in silence. Hours passed, the courthouse restless with breath and footsteps. Then they returned, their verdict delivered in a voice that did not waver. Guilty. Jonas Hale stared forward, his face unchanged, as though the word itself were another hymn, one he had already rehearsed. In the gallery, Laura wept without sound. David placed his hand on hers, steady, unyielding. Mark closed his map and lowered his head. When the gavel struck, the objects were sealed again. Candle stubs, hymn sheets, scraps of wax, all returned to boxes. The handkerchief was folded one final time, tagged as Exhibit 12, locked in evidence storage. The courthouse emptied, but silence lingered. The room smelled of extinguished candles, though none had burned there. The echoes of whispered chants seemed woven into the walls, and on the table, as jurors filed out. The last thing to be cleared was the handkerchief, pale against the dark wood, edges stained, its presence colder than any sentence pronounced that day. The verdict spread through the valley before the ink dried. Headlines framed it as justice. Assistant pastor guilty, cult rumors settled, closure delivered. Yet no one in town spoke of closure. Doors remained shut, vigils ended without song, and children still glanced toward the tree line before walking home. The forest seemed taller now, its shadows longer, as though it had listened to every word spoken in court. The Raines family packed their belongings quietly. Their house, once filled with voices, echoed with cardboard boxes and the scrape of tape. David moved through each room with heavy steps, pausing at the doorway of Emily's bedroom. Her toys still lined the shelf, a school sweater folded neatly at the foot of her bed. Laura refused to touch them. She said the air smelled of her daughter still, faint as dust, and she wanted that to remain for whoever lived there next. Mark dismantled the map. He pulled pins from the wall one by one, the strings sagging, then falling in coils onto the floor. He folded the paper carefully and slid it into an envelope. He told his sister it was not for police, not for archives, but for memory. A record of what the town had tried, even if the answers came too late. At the evidence storage in Salem, boxes were stacked floor to ceiling. Labels marked with case numbers sat in ordered rows, some already yellowing. On a steel shelf, a single container bore the name Rains. Inside rested the white handkerchief, now dulled with age, its fibers fragile. Sealed behind plastic, it no longer carried comfort, no longer a mother's relic. It was catalogued as Exhibit 12, cold and official. Yet for those who had touched it, it remained heavier than proof. The shack in the woods was torn down that autumn. Deputies burned its timber, the smell of smoke drifting through the valley for hours. But when the ashes cooled, children who wandered too close whispered that they still saw shapes in the clearing at night. Rings in the soil where candles had once stood. Shadows that seemed to gather even without flame. In the church, pews remained crooked, hymnals still feathered at the edges. Attendance dwindled. When the bell rang, its sound seemed to tremble, carrying not comfort, but reminder. Few looked toward the pulpit where Jonas had once stood. Fewer still entered the basement. Laura and David drove east weeks later, their car packed tight, the valley shrinking in the rearview mirror. Neither spoke as the ridges slipped behind them. On her lap, Laura held only a photograph. Emily in summer clothes, hair falling across her face, handkerchief clutched in her palm. The image had become her only possession of that fabric she had once refused to release. Justice had been pronounced, yet the air of the town never cleared. Whispers lingered, carried in shops and fields, muttered by children too young to remember the trial but old enough to inherit its silence. They spoke not of guilt or sentence, but of chants in the trees, of candles glowing in places no one dared walk. In the years that followed, each family chose its own story. Some insisted the trial had revealed everything, that justice was sealed with Exhibit 12. Others swore pieces were missing, that voices still carried across the valley at night, too layered to be wind. The valley learned to live with both truths. In the sealed evidence room, the handkerchief waited, edges stiff, faint stains preserved by cold light. It had traveled from pew to vigil, from a mother's hand to a courtroom. Now it rested alone, silent, nothing more than fabric marked by ink and tag. Yet those who had seen it swore the folds still held shape, as if pressed by small fingers, as if refusing to forget the hands that once refused to let it go. And in the dark of that room, when the lights flickered low, the fabric seemed almost to breathe.